Welcome to channel. This episode brings us to the year 1857, telling the story of Moses Walker, a man the slave trade dismissed as worthless, who would later become one of the most feared and sought-after figures in all of Louisiana. What follows is a heavy account of injustice, endurance, and a transformation history did not expect. Pause for a moment. Take a breath and listen closely. If these stories matter to you, subscribe to the channel and share in the comments the city and country you're listening from. Your engagement helps ensure these lives are remembered, not erased. Let's begin. In the summer of 1901, a historian from Harvard University traveled to a small town in Ontario, Canada, searching for a story that had become legend in the American South. He was looking for a man named Moses Walker. What he found instead was a grave in a quiet cemetery, a widow who still wept when she spoke her husband's name, and a tale so extraordinary he spent the next 3 years trying to verify it. The story he uncovered would never appear in official history books. It was too brutal, too unsettling, too dangerous for a nation still healing from the wounds of slavery. But the historian wrote it down anyway in a private journal that would not be discovered until 1987, hidden in the archives of the university library. This is that story. The story of a man born with a face so disfigured that no one would buy him. A man who spent 32 years being treated as less than human. A man who became the most wanted fugitive in Louisiana history. And a man who destroyed everyone who ever made him suffer. His name was Moses Walker, and what he did in the year 1857 still haunts the bayous of Louisiana to this day. Let me take you back to a place called St. Landry Parish, in the heart of Cajun country. The year was 1825, and a baby was being born in a wooden shack behind the sugar fields of Bellefontaine Plantation. The midwife who delivered that baby was a 60-year-old enslaved woman named Aunt Cora. She had brought hundreds of children into the world over her lifetime. She had seen babies born too early, babies born too late, babies who lived, and babies who died. She thought she had seen everything. She was wrong. When the baby emerged, Aunt Cora screamed. She stumbled backward, knocking over the basin of water, nearly dropping the newborn on the dirt floor. The other women in the shack rushed forward, thinking something had gone terribly wrong with the birth. Then they saw the baby's face, and they screamed too. The left side of the infant's face was covered in a massive purple growth. It spread from his forehead to his chin, engulfing his eye, distorting his features, making him look like something from a nightmare. His left eye was white and blank, without pupil or iris, like a marble pressed into raw meat. The skin around the growth was wrinkled and twisted, as if it had been melted and reformed by some terrible fire. "Devil child," Aunt Cora whispered, backing away. That baby been marked by the devil himself. The mother, a young woman named Sarah who had labored for 16 hours to bring this child into the world, reached out with trembling hands. "Let me see him. Let me see my baby." They gave her the child. Sarah looked at her son's face for a long moment. The other women waited for her to scream, to cry, to push the baby away in horror. Instead, she smiled. "He's beautiful," she said softly. "He's my beautiful boy." Sarah named him Moses, after the prophet who led his people out of slavery. She believed that God had a purpose for her son, even if she could not understand what it was. She believed that the mark on his face was not a curse, but a sign, a symbol of something greater to come. Sarah died 3 days later from complications of childbirth. She never got to see her beautiful boy grow up. She never got to protect him from what was coming. Moses Walker entered the world alone, disfigured, and motherless. And for the next 32 years, the world would make him pay for all three. Bellefontaine Plantation covered over 3,000 acres of prime Louisiana farmland. It was one of the largest sugar operations in St. Landry Parish, producing over 2 million pounds of sugar annually. The plantation was home to 612 enslaved people who worked the cane fields from sunrise to sunset, cutting and processing the stalks that made their owner one of the wealthiest men in the state. That owner was Colonel Philippe Beaumont. Colonel Beaumont was 58 years old in 1857, the third generation of his family to own Bellefontaine. His grandfather had carved the plantation out of raw swamp land in 1785, fighting alligators, disease, and hostile Native Americans to establish a foothold in the Louisiana wilderness. His father had expanded it, buying up neighboring farms, acquiring more enslaved workers, building the grand white mansion that dominated the landscape like a temple to wealth and power. Philippe Beaumont had inherited all of this at the age of 25, and he had spent the next 3 decades proving that he was worthy of the legacy. He was a shrewd businessman, a ruthless negotiator, and a respected member of Louisiana society. He served in the state legislature. He donated generously to the Catholic Church. He hosted lavish parties that attracted the elite of the South. He was also, by any standard of human decency, a monster. Colonel Beaumont collected things. Fine wines from France, antique furniture from England, rare books from around the world. But his most prized collection was something else entirely. He collected instruments of torture. His private study contained over 40 devices designed to inflict pain on the human body. Thumb screws from medieval Spain. Branding irons from the Caribbean. Whips with metal tips that could strip flesh from bone. Masks that forced the wearer's mouth open, making it impossible to speak or scream. Beaumont had acquired these items from estate sales, private dealers, and fellow collectors who shared his interests. And he used them. Not often, not publicly. But when a slave needed to be disciplined, when an example needed to be made, Colonel Beaumont would retire to a special room in the basement of the mansion. What happened in that room was known only to the victims and to Beaumont himself. But the screams could sometimes be heard from the slave quarters, carried on the wind like the cries of damned souls. Beaumont had a philosophy about slavery that he would share with anyone who asked. He believed that Africans were not fully human. He believed that their souls were corrupted, tainted by centuries of heathen worship. And he believed that suffering could purify those souls, could burn away the corruption and make them worthy of salvation. "I am not cruel," he would say, swirling expensive brandy in a crystal glass. "I am merciful. I am giving them the gift of purification. They should thank me." Moses Walker was his favorite subject. From the moment Moses was old enough to work, Beaumont had taken a special interest in him. The boy's disfigured face fascinated the colonel. He saw it as proof of his theories about African corruption. Here was a child so tainted that the corruption had manifested physically, marking him for all to see. Beaumont tried to sell Moses 3 times. The first attempt came when Moses was 12 years old. The colonel brought him to a slave auction in New Orleans, hoping that some buyer might take the boy off his hands. But when Moses was displayed on the auction block, the crowd reacted with disgust. Buyers turned away. Some laughed. One man spat on the ground and said he would not take such a creature for free. Moses stood on that block for 4 hours. No one bid a single dollar. The second attempt came when Moses was 18. Beaumont lowered the asking price to $100, a fraction of what a healthy young male slave was worth. Again, no buyers. "That thing would scare my horses," one farmer said. "It would give my children nightmares." The third attempt came when Moses was 25. By then, Beaumont had given up on getting any money for him. He offered Moses as a bonus, a free addition to any purchase of 5 or more slaves. Still, no one wanted him. "I don't need bad luck on my plantation," a buyer explained. "A face like that brings nothing but trouble." After the third failed sale, Colonel Beaumont accepted that Moses was unsellable. He was stuck with the disfigured slave for life. And since he could not profit from Moses, he decided to use him for something else. Entertainment. Moses was assigned to the most degrading jobs on the plantation. He cleaned the latrines, digging out human waste with his bare hands and carrying it to the fields as fertilizer. He collected the bodies of slaves who died and transported them to the burial ground, sometimes dragging corpses for miles in the summer heat. He was the one who cleaned up after punishments, mopping blood from floors, disposing of severed fingers or ears that had been removed as discipline. But that was not enough for Beaumont. He wanted more. Whenever the colonel hosted dinner parties, Moses was ordered to serve at the table. Not because he was skilled at service, but because his presence created a reaction. Guests would gasp when they saw him. Women would cover their mouths. Men would make cruel jokes. "Behold," Madame Beaumont would announce, gesturing toward Moses with her wine glass. "Our little monster. Is he not fascinating? I keep him as a curiosity, like a two-headed calf or a bearded lady at the circus." The guests would laugh. Moses would stand motionless, his one good eye fixed on the floor, his face betraying nothing. Inside, he was screaming. Inside, he was dying. But outside, he showed nothing. He had learned long ago that showing emotion only made things worse. Madame Céline Beaumont was, in some ways, crueler than her husband. The Colonel's cruelty was cold and calculated, driven by twisted philosophy and a desire for control. Madame Beaumont's cruelty was personal. She enjoyed watching Moses suffer. She enjoyed humiliating him. She enjoyed reminding him at every opportunity that he was less than nothing. "My pet monster," she called him, scratching him behind the ear like a dog when guests were watching. So ugly that even the devil would not claim him, but useful for entertaining company. She had rules for Moses. He was not allowed to look at white people directly. He was not allowed to speak unless spoken to. He was not allowed to eat until everyone else on the plantation had finished, which often meant he went to bed hungry. He was required to bow whenever a member of the Beaumont family passed, even if they passed him a dozen times a day. Violations of these rules were punished immediately, not with whipping. That would leave marks, and Madame Beaumont wanted her monster presentable for guests. Instead, she had creative punishments, making Moses stand in the sun for hours without water, locking him in a small box overnight, forcing him to eat his meals from a trough on his hands and knees like a pig. But the worst torment came from Jack Beaumont, the Colonel's only son. Jack was 24 years old in 1857, the heir to Bellefontaine and everything it represented. He had been raised with every privilege imaginable: private tutors, European travel, the finest clothes and horses money could buy. He had never worked a day in his life and never intended to. His only skills were drinking, gambling, and inflicting pain on those weaker than himself. Jack had discovered Moses when he was just 8 years old. He had been wandering the plantation, bored, looking for something to do, when he stumbled upon the disfigured slave cleaning out a stable. "What are you?" the boy had asked, staring at Moses's face with a mixture of horror and fascination. Moses, who was 16 at the time, had not known how to respond. He was not supposed to speak to members of the Beaumont family unless asked a direct question that required an answer. "I asked you a question, monster," Jack had said, picking up a rock from the ground. "What are you?" "I am Moses, young master," Moses had replied, keeping his eyes down. "I work in the stables." "You're ugly," Jack had observed. "The ugliest thing I've ever seen." "I bet you're ugly inside, too. I bet if I cut you open, your guts would be ugly." And then, without warning, the 8-year-old boy had thrown the rock at Moses's face. It struck him on the jaw, splitting the skin, drawing blood. Jack had laughed with delight. "You bleed red," he had said, surprised. "I thought monsters bled black." That was the beginning of 16 years of torment. As Jack grew older, his cruelty grew more sophisticated. He graduated from throwing rocks to throwing knives. He would make Moses stand against a wall while he practiced his aim, seeing how close he could get without actually hitting him. Sometimes he missed on purpose, leaving Moses with cuts on his arms and legs that took weeks to heal. When Jack was old enough to shoot, he used Moses for target practice. He would fire his pistol inches from Moses's head, laughing as the enslaved man flinched, as his ears rang from the explosion. "Dance, monster," he would shout, firing at Moses's feet, forcing him to jump and dodge. "Dance for me." Once, when Moses failed to dodge quickly enough, a bullet grazed his thigh. The wound became infected, and Moses nearly died. Colonel Beaumont was furious, not at his son for shooting a slave, but at the slave for getting injured and being unable to work. "Be more careful next time," he told Jack. "That creature is useless enough without you crippling it." Jack apologized to his father. He never apologized to Moses. By the time Moses was 32 years old, he had endured more suffering than most people could imagine. His body was covered in scars. His spirit had been broken and rebuilt so many times that it was held together by nothing but pure will. He had watched other slaves come and go, sold away to other plantations, escaping to the north, dying from disease or overwork or punishment. He had watched families torn apart, children ripped from their mothers, husbands separated from wives. He had seen the full horror of American slavery, and he had survived it all. But survival was not living. Moses Walker existed, but he did not live. He moved through his days like a ghost, performing his duties, enduring his torments, waiting for nothing except the release of death. And then something changed. In the spring of 1851, a Catholic priest arrived in St. Landry Parish. His name was Father Antoine Marchand, and he had been sent from New Orleans to minister to the spiritual needs of the rural communities. Officially, his job was to serve the white Catholic families of the region, performing masses, hearing confessions, baptizing babies. Unofficially, Father Marchand had another mission entirely. He was an abolitionist. Not openly, of course. An open abolitionist in Louisiana in 1851 would have been hanged from the nearest tree. But Father Marchand believed that slavery was a sin against God, and he had dedicated his life to fighting it in whatever ways he could. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves find their way to freedom. Over the years, he had guided dozens of fugitives out of Louisiana, through Mississippi and Tennessee, up to the Free States and on to Canada. Father Marchand came to Bellefontaine on a Sunday morning in April to say Mass for the Beaumont family. The colonel and his wife sat in the front pew, dressed in their finest clothes, performing their weekly display of piety. The slaves attended from the back of the chapel, standing because there were no seats for them, listening to a service in a language most did not understand. The priest noticed Moses immediately. Everyone noticed Moses. But while others looked at the disfigured face and saw a monster, Father Marchand saw something else. He saw intelligence. He saw awareness. He saw a mind trapped behind that ruined face, watching, analyzing, waiting. After the Mass, Marchand found an excuse to speak with Moses. He asked for help carrying some books to his carriage. As they walked together, the priest asked a simple question. "Can you read?" Moses was so startled that he almost dropped the books. Reading was forbidden. Teaching a slave to read was a crime in Louisiana, punishable by heavy fines for the teacher and severe whipping for the slave. The question itself was dangerous. But something in the priest's eyes told Moses that this was not a trap. This was an opportunity. "No, Father," Moses said carefully. "I cannot read." Marchand nodded slowly. "Would you like to learn?" Moses did not answer immediately. He had spent 30 years learning to suppress his desires, his hopes, his dreams. He had learned that wanting things only led to disappointment. But here was a white man, a priest, offering him something that could change everything. "Yes," Moses finally said. "I would like to learn." That Sunday began a secret education that would last 3 years. Father Marchand visited Bellefontaine regularly, officiating at masses, hearing confessions, performing the duties expected of a parish priest. But late at night, in an abandoned cabin at the edge of the swamp, he met with Moses and taught him to read. They started with the Bible, the only book that would not arouse suspicion if discovered. Moses learned his letters by candlelight, tracing them with his finger, sounding them out in a whispered voice. He learned words, then sentences, then paragraphs. Within 6 months, he was reading fluently. Within a year, he was reading everything the priest could bring him. Father Marchand was amazed by Moses's intelligence. The enslaved man absorbed knowledge like dry earth absorbing rain. He read histories of ancient civilizations and understood the patterns of rise and fall. He read philosophy and grasped concepts that university students struggled with. He read law books and memorized the statutes that governed slavery in Louisiana, learning the system that oppressed him with the same precision he might learn the workings of a machine. "You have a remarkable mind," the priest told him one night. In another life, you could have been a scholar, a leader, a great man. Moses looked at him with his one good eye. In this life, I am property. My mind belongs to Colonel Beaumont, just like my body. Bodies can be owned, Marchand said. Minds cannot. Your thoughts are your own. No one can take them from you. Moses considered this. Then my thoughts are the only free thing about me. For now, the priest said. But perhaps not forever. Over the following months, their conversation shifted from education to something more dangerous. Marchand told Moses about the Underground Railroad, about the network of safe houses and secret routes that helped slaves escape to freedom. He told him about Canada, where slavery was illegal, where black men and women lived as free citizens. He told him that escape was possible, that freedom was possible, that a different life was possible. Moses listened carefully to everything. He memorized routes and contacts and codes. He learned which stars to follow, which rivers to cross, which signs marked safe houses. He stored all of this information in his remarkable memory, building a mental map of liberation. But Moses was not planning to use this knowledge for himself. Not yet. He had other plans first. Because Moses had also been asking the priest different questions. Questions about the Beaumont family's business dealings. Questions about the political situation in Louisiana. Questions about how power worked, how it could be obtained, and how it could be destroyed. Father Marchand began to realize that he was not simply teaching a slave to read. He was arming a weapon. In the fall of 1854, a new slave arrived at Bellefontaine. Her name was Delilah. She was 25 years old, tall and strong, with hands that showed the calluses of hard labor. She had been purchased from a plantation in South Carolina that was liquidating its assets after the owner's death. She was assigned to the main house, working in the kitchen and helping with cleaning. Delilah had her own history of sorrow. She had been married to a man named Thomas, and together they had a daughter named Grace. When Grace was 3 years old, the master sold Thomas to a plantation in Mississippi. A year later, he sold Grace to a buyer in Atlanta. Delilah never saw her husband or daughter again. The loss had nearly destroyed her. For months after Grace was taken, Delilah barely ate, barely spoke, barely functioned. She moved through her days like a ghost, going through the motions of life without actually living. Part of her had died when that wagon carried her daughter away, and she did not know if it would ever come back. Then she came to Bellefontaine, and she met Moses Walker. The first time Delilah saw Moses, she did not look away. She did not gasp or grimace or make a cruel comment. She simply looked at him, met his eyes for a moment, and then went about her business. That simple act of ordinary humanity was so unusual that Moses did not know how to process it. For 30 years, every encounter with another person had been defined by his face, horror, disgust, mockery, pity at best. But this woman had looked at him as if he were just another person, as if his face did not matter. They began talking, small conversations at first, the kind of cautious exchanges that enslaved people learned to have, saying little of substance in case someone was listening. But over time, as they grew to trust each other, the conversations deepened. Delilah told Moses about Thomas and Grace, about the grief that never went away, about the prayers she said every night, hoping that somewhere, somehow, her daughter was still alive. Moses told Delilah about his life, about the years of torment, about the secret education with Father Marchand, about the plans that were forming in his mind, plans he had never spoken aloud to anyone. What kind of plans? Delilah asked one night when they were alone behind the kitchen. Moses was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, plans to make them pay. Delilah did not flinch. She did not tell him such thoughts were dangerous. She did not counsel patience or forgiveness or acceptance. Instead, she reached out and touched his face, the disfigured side, the part that no one ever touched. Tell me, she said. And Moses did. Their relationship deepened over the following months. They found stolen moments together, hidden from the eyes that were always watching. They fell in love, though neither of them dared to use that word. Love was a luxury that slaves could not afford. Love was a vulnerability, a weakness that could be exploited. If the Beaumonts discovered their relationship, they would use it against them, threatening one to control the other. But they could not stop themselves. After so many years of isolation, of being treated as a monster, Moses had finally found someone who saw him as a man. And Delilah, after losing everyone she loved, had finally found someone worth loving again. In January of 1857, Delilah discovered that she was pregnant. The news should have been joyful. A child was a miracle, a promise of continuity, a reason to hope. But in the world of slavery, a child was also property. Any baby born to Delilah would belong to Colonel Beaumont from its first breath. It would grow up enslaved, subject to the same horrors that Moses and Delilah had endured. And if the child was born with Moses's disfigurement, its fate would be even worse. Moses held Delilah while she told him, feeling her body tremble against his. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. Moses had been planning for years, reading, learning, preparing. But he had always imagined that his revenge would be a solitary act, a final statement before capture or death. He had not planned for a family. He had not planned for something worth living for. Now everything changed. "We are going to leave," Moses said. "We are going to escape, and we are going to take our child to freedom." Delilah looked at him. "How?" "They will hunt us. Your face, they will recognize you anywhere. We would not get 10 miles. Moses smiled, a rare expression that transformed his ruined features into something almost gentle. "Let me worry about my face. You just worry about keeping yourself and our baby healthy. We leave in October, during Madame Beaumont's birthday celebration. The whole plantation will be distracted. And by the time they realize we are gone, it will be too late." "Too late for what?" Moses's smile faded, replaced by something harder. "Too late to save themselves." The months leading up to October 1857 were the busiest of Moses's life. He continued his degrading duties during the day, cleaning latrines, hauling bodies, serving at dinner parties, enduring the endless humiliations that had defined his existence. But at night, in the darkness of his cabin and in secret meetings with Father Marchand, he prepared. First, the money. Moses began stealing from the Beaumonts, tiny amounts that would not be noticed. A coin here, a piece of silver there. Over the months, he accumulated nearly $200 in cash and valuables, enough to buy silence, bribe guards, pay for passage. Second, the information. Moses studied Bellefontaine more intensely than ever before. He memorized the schedules of every overseer, the habits of every guard, the layout of every building. He identified the weak points in the plantation security, the gaps that could be exploited. Third, the weapons. Moses had no access to guns or knives, but he had something else, knowledge. He knew how to make simple weapons from materials that were available to him. He fashioned a blade from a piece of scrap metal, sharpening it against a stone until it could cut through leather. He created small smoke bombs from chemicals he found in the storage buildings, devices that could create confusion and cover his escape. Fourth, the documents. Moses knew that the most dangerous secrets were not physical, but informational. Through careful observation and occasional theft, he accumulated evidence of Colonel Beaumont's activities. Letters that revealed illegal business dealings. Records of bribes paid to local officials. And, most damning of all, correspondence that proved the colonel's involvement in a conspiracy to assassinate a state legislator who had proposed reforms to the treatment of slaves. Moses copied the most incriminating documents in his careful handwriting and hid them in multiple locations. If anything happened to him, this information would still come to light. The colonel's secrets would be exposed regardless. And fifth, the revenge. Moses had not forgotten the years of torment, the humiliations, the beatings, the constant reminder that he was less than human. He had forgiven none of it. And he had a plan to make the Beaumont family pay for everything they had done. Not just to him, to every slave who had ever suffered on this plantation. To every family that had been torn apart. To every life that had been destroyed in the name of profit and power. The Beaumonts thought Moses was a monster. They had treated him like an animal for 32 years. They had no idea that the real monster was not his face, but his mind. And that mind had been planning their destruction for years. October 17, 1857, arrived with clear skies and cool temperatures. It was the perfect day for a celebration, and Madame Beaumont intended to make the most of it. Her 50th birthday party would be the social event of the season. Over 100 guests had been invited from plantations across Louisiana. Caterers had been brought in from New Orleans. Musicians would play until dawn. The champagne would flow like water. Moses watched the preparations from the shadows, observing the chaos of activity that would provide his cover. Servants ran everywhere, setting up tables, arranging flowers, preparing food. Guests began arriving in the late afternoon, their carriages filling the circular drive in front of the mansion. Men in tailored suits and women in imported gowns stepped out, greeting each other with kisses and handshakes, ready for an evening of excess. Moses went through his normal duties, appearing as invisible and subservient as always. He served drinks. He cleaned up spills. He endured the usual comments about his appearance. "Good God, Celine, must we look at that thing while we eat? Adds to the ambience, does it not? Like a gargoyle at a cathedral." Inside, Moses was counting down the hours. At 8 o'clock, the party was in full swing. The main hall of the mansion blazed with candlelight. A string quartet played Mozart. Guests danced and laughed and drank and ate, celebrating the birthday of a woman who had built her happiness on the misery of hundreds. At 9 o'clock, Moses slipped away from the party. No one noticed. No one ever noticed Moses unless they wanted to mock him. He made his way to the cabin where Delilah was waiting. She was ready, dressed in dark clothes, carrying a small bundle containing everything they would take with them. Her face was calm, but Moses could see the fear in her eyes. "It is time," he said. "I know." She took his hand. "I am ready." Moses squeezed her fingers gently. "Go to the edge of the swamp where we practiced. Wait for me there. I will come within the hour." "What are you going to do?" Moses did not answer directly. Instead, he kissed her forehead, feeling the warmth of her skin, memorizing the moment. "I am going to make sure no one follows us." He watched her disappear into the darkness. Then he turned back toward the mansion, toward the celebration, toward the family that had tormented him for 32 years. It was time to settle accounts. The first stop was Colonel Beaumont's private study. Moses had cleaned this room hundreds of times. He knew every inch of it, the mahogany desk imported from England, the leather chairs, the shelves lined with books that the colonel had never read. He knew where Beaumont kept his important documents, in a locked drawer on the left side of the desk. He knew where the safe was hidden, behind a portrait of the colonel's father. The lock on the drawer yielded easily to Moses's improvised picks. Inside, he found exactly what he expected: contracts, deeds, financial records, and the letters he had seen before. The letters that proved Beaumont's involvement in conspiracy and corruption. Moses took the most damaging documents and tucked them into his shirt. The rest he scattered across the floor, making sure they would be found. The safe was more challenging. It was a heavy iron box with a combination lock, the kind that could not be picked. But Moses had prepared for this. Over the past months, he had watched Colonel Beaumont open the safe on 3 separate occasions, carefully observing the movements of his fingers. The combination was the 23rd of August, 47, the birth date of Beaumont's late mother. The safe opened with a satisfying click. Inside was cash, nearly $3,000 in bills and gold coins. There were also jewelry boxes containing pieces that Madame Beaumont wore only on special occasions. And there were more documents, even more incriminating than the ones in the drawer. Moses took everything. The second stop was the wine cellar. Bellefontaine's wine collection was famous throughout Louisiana. Colonel Beaumont had spent decades acquiring rare vintages from France, Spain, Italy, and Germany. The cellar contained over 5,000 bottles, worth more than many plantations. Moses did not touch the wine. Instead, he went to the back of the cellar where barrels of brandy and whiskey were stored for everyday use. He opened the taps on 3 of the largest barrels, letting the alcohol pour out onto the stone floor. It would take hours for anyone to notice, and by then thousands of dollars of spirits would have drained away. But that was not the main purpose. The alcohol spreading across the floor would serve another function soon. The third stop was the stable. Moses opened every stall door and cut every rope. The horses did not bolt immediately. They were confused by the sudden freedom. But Moses knew that something would startle them before the night was over. When it did, they would run, and the plantation would lose its fastest means of pursuit. The fourth stop was the most dangerous. Moses climbed the servants' stairs to the second floor of the mansion. The party continued below, the sounds of music and laughter floating up through the floorboards. He moved silently down the hallway, past guest rooms where visitors' luggage was stored, past the door to Madame Beaumont's private chambers, until he reached the room at the end of the hall. Jack Beaumont's bedroom. Moses knew that Jack was not at the party. The young man had drunk too much earlier in the evening and had stumbled upstairs to sleep it off. This was not unusual. Jack often disappeared during social events, too intoxicated to maintain the facade of respectability that his parents required. Moses opened the door without knocking. The room was dark except for a single candle burning on the nightstand. Jack was sprawled across the bed, still wearing his evening clothes, snoring loudly. An empty bottle of bourbon lay on the floor beside him. Moses stood over the bed, looking down at the man who had tormented him for 16 years. The man who had thrown rocks at his face. The man who had used him for target practice. The man who had promised to mount his head on the wall like a hunting trophy. For a long moment, Moses did nothing. He simply watched Jack sleep, thinking about all the times he had stood helpless while this man inflicted pain on him. All the times he had wished for the power to fight back. All the times he had dreamed of this moment. Then Moses picked up a pillow from the foot of the bed. Jack woke up when the pillow pressed against his face. His eyes flew open, confusion turning to terror as he realized he could not breathe. He struggled, his hands clawing at Moses's arms, his legs kicking against the mattress. But Moses was strong, far stronger than his stooped posture and submissive demeanor suggested. 30 years of hard labor had built muscles like iron beneath his scarred skin. The struggle lasted less than 2 minutes. When it was over, Moses removed the pillow and looked at Jack Beaumont's face. The young man's eyes were open, staring at nothing. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream. "You wanted to see how monsters bleed," Moses said quietly. "Now you know how they kill." He arranged the body on the bed, positioning it to look like Jack had simply fallen asleep. He placed the empty bourbon bottle on the nightstand. When the body was discovered, it would appear that the young heir had drunk himself to death. A tragedy, but not a surprising one, given his habits. Moses left the room and closed the door behind him. The fifth and final stop was the kitchen. Behind the main cooking area was a storage room where firewood and kindling were kept. Moses arranged a small pile of kindling against the wall, near several sacks of flour that would help the fire spread. He lit a candle, positioned it carefully among the kindling, and calculated how long it would take for the flame to reach the wood. About an hour. Long enough for him to be far away when the fire started. Long enough for the flames to spread through the kitchen before anyone noticed. Long enough for the fire to reach the wine cellar, where thousands of gallons of alcohol were waiting to explode. Moses Walker left Bellefontaine Plantation for the last time just before 10 o'clock on the night of October 17, 1857. Behind him, a celebration continued, guests dancing and drinking, unaware that death and destruction were already in motion. Ahead of him, Delilah waited at the edge of the swamp, carrying their unborn child toward freedom. And within a few hours, the Beaumont family would discover that the monster they had tormented for 32 years had finally shown them what a real monster could do. The fire started shortly after 11 o'clock. A servant noticed smoke coming from the kitchen and raised the alarm. By the time anyone responded, flames had already spread through the storage room and into the main cooking area. The wooden walls, dried by decades of heat from the ovens, caught fire like kindling. Within minutes, the entire kitchen wing was engulfed. The guests evacuated in panic. Women in silk gowns stumbled across the lawn, their shoes sinking into the grass. Men shouted orders that no one followed. Servants ran in every direction, some trying to fight the fire, others trying to save valuables, most simply trying to escape. Then the fire reached the wine cellar. The alcohol that Moses had released hours earlier had spread across the stone floor, seeping into cracks, pooling in corners, filling the air with invisible fumes. When the flames found this reservoir, the cellar exploded. The blast shook the entire mansion, shattering windows and knocking people off their feet. A column of fire erupted from the cellar doors, shooting 30 feet into the air. The heat was so intense that it ignited the walls of the adjacent rooms. By midnight, half of the Bellefontaine mansion was in flames. Colonel Beaumont watched his ancestral home burn with a face that showed no emotion. He had survived the initial explosion, having been in the front parlor when the cellar ignited. Now he stood on the lawn, surrounded by hysterical guests and panicking servants, watching generations of wealth and history turn to ash. "Where is Jacques?" Madame Beaumont screamed, grabbing her husband's arm. "Where is my son?" Beaumont turned to look at her. In the chaos, he had not thought about Jacques. He had assumed his son was somewhere in the crowd, drunk as usual, but safe. "Find him," Beaumont ordered a nearby overseer. "Search the house." The overseer looked at the burning mansion, at the flames pouring from every window, at the roof that was beginning to collapse. "Sir, no one can go in there. It is suicide." I said, "Find my son." But there was no need to search. An hour later, when the fire had finally burned itself out and the ruins had cooled enough to approach, they found Jacques Beaumont's body in his bedroom. The room had been largely spared by the fire, protected by stone walls on 3 sides. Jacques lay on his bed, seemingly untouched by the flames, looking almost peaceful. The doctor who examined the body declared that young Master Beaumont had died of alcohol poisoning. His heart had simply stopped, overwhelmed by years of excessive drinking. "Oh, tragedy," the doctor said. "Such a young man. Such a waste." Colonel Beaumont accepted this explanation. He had no reason to suspect anything else. Jacques' drinking was well known. It was only a matter of time before it killed him. The fact that it happened on the same night as the fire was a cruel coincidence, nothing more. It was not until the next morning that someone noticed Moses Walker was missing. And Delilah, too. Beaumont stood in the ruins of his study, surrounded by scattered papers and broken furniture, and realized what had happened. The fire was not an accident. The stolen money. The open safe. The incriminating documents strewn across the floor for anyone to find. This was sabotage. This was revenge. The monster had bitten back. "Find them," Beaumont said, his voice cold with fury. "Find them and bring them to me. I want them alive. I want them to suffer." He offered a reward of $10,000 for the capture of Moses Walker. It was the largest bounty ever posted for a fugitive slave in Louisiana history. Posters were printed and distributed across the state within days. The description was detailed and unmistakable. Asterisk male, 32 years old, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall. Face severely disfigured with purple birthmark covering left side. Left eye white and blind. Impossible to mistake for anyone else. Extremely dangerous. Wanted alive. Asterisk. Slave catchers from across the South descended on Louisiana. Professional bounty hunters who made their living tracking fugitives. Amateur fortune seekers hoping to claim the massive reward. Militia groups who enjoyed the sport of hunting humans. Dogs trained to follow scent trails through swamps and forests. All of them searching for one man with a face that could not be hidden. The largest manhunt in Louisiana history had begun. And Moses Walker was already gone. Moses and Delilah traveled through the swamps for the first 3 days, following routes that Father Marchand had described in detail. They moved at night, navigating by the stars, wading through water that sometimes reached their chests. During the day, they hid in the densest thicket they could find, sleeping in shifts, always listening for the sound of dogs or men. The swamps of Louisiana were dangerous, even for those who knew them well. Alligators lurked in the murky water. Venomous snakes hung from low branches. The mud could swallow a person whole if they stepped in the wrong place. But Moses had studied these swamps for years, gathering information from other slaves who had worked in them, memorizing the safe paths and the deadly traps. By the fourth day, they had covered nearly 40 miles and reached a small settlement hidden deep in the bayou. It was a community of free Creoles and mixed-race families who lived outside the boundaries of white society. They were not part of the Underground Railroad, but they were sympathetic to fugitives and willing to help, for a price. The leader of the community was an old man known only as Papa Legba. He was rumored to be a voodoo priest, a practitioner of the old African religions that had survived the Middle Passage. Whether this was true or not, Moses did not know or care. What mattered was that Papa Legba could provide shelter and information. Moses paid the old man $50 in gold coins. In exchange, Papa Legba agreed to hide Delilah until Moses returned. Returned from where? Delilah asked, fear creeping into her voice. Where are you going? Moses took her hands in his. I have to go back. Back to Bellefontaine? Moses, they will kill you. They will not find me. But I have unfinished business. The colonel is still alive. His wife is still alive. And as long as they are alive, they will never stop hunting us. They will spend every dollar they have, send every man they can hire, search every corner of this country until they find us. Delilah shook her head. Then we run. We run to Canada, like you planned. And spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. Spend the rest of our lives knowing that they are still out there, still searching, still waiting. What kind of life would that be for our child? Delilah had no answer. She knew Moses was right. She knew that the Beaumonts would never stop. Their pride would not allow it. Their hatred would not allow it. As long as they had breath in their bodies, they would hunt the slave who had humiliated them. What are you going to do? She finally asked. Moses looked at her with his one good eye. I am going to destroy them. Not just hurt them. Destroy them. Take everything they have, their money, their reputation, their power. By the time I am finished, the name Beaumont will be worthless in Louisiana. He paused. And then I will come back for you. And we will go to Canada together. We will raise our child in freedom, and we will never think about Bellefontaine again. Delilah wanted to argue. She wanted to beg him to stay, to abandon his revenge, to run with her while they still could. But she knew Moses. She knew the determination that burned behind that ruined face. She knew that he would not rest until the accounts were settled. Promise me you will come back, she said. Moses kissed her gently. I promise. He left that night, heading back toward the world he had just escaped, toward the enemies who wanted him dead, toward a reckoning that had been 32 years in the making. Moses knew that his face was his greatest weakness. The posters were everywhere, describing his disfigurement in precise detail. Anyone who saw him would recognize him instantly. He could not walk into a town, could not travel on roads, could not interact with anyone without being identified. So he decided to change his face. The idea came to him during his second night alone in the swamp. He was hiding in a dense thicket, watching a group of slave catchers pass by on a nearby road. There were 3 of them, rough men on horseback, armed with rifles and pistols, accompanied by 2 bloodhounds straining at their leashes. Moses watched them pass and felt something shift in his mind. These men were hunting him like an animal. They expected him to run, to hide, to cower in fear. They did not expect him to fight back. But what if he did? What if instead of being the prey, he became the predator? The thought took root and would not let go. Moses began to plan. 3 days later, he set his trap. He chose a location carefully, a narrow path through the swamp, the only dry route for miles, a place where pursuers would have to travel single file. He created a false trail leading to this path, making it obvious enough that even mediocre trackers could follow it. Then he hid in the brush beside the path and waited. The slave catchers arrived the next morning. There were 3 of them, different men than the ones he had seen before, but the same type. Hard faces, cruel eyes, the kind of men who enjoyed hunting humans. They were following his trail, confident that their prey was running scared. Moses let the first man pass. He let the second man pass. When the third man was directly beside him, Moses moved. He had fashioned a weapon from a heavy branch and a piece of sharp metal. It was crude but effective. The third man died without making a sound, the improvised blade piercing his throat before he knew anything was wrong. His body slumped in the saddle, then slid to the ground. The second man heard the splash and turned. Moses was already on him, pulling him from his horse, driving the blade into his chest. The man tried to scream, but only produced a wet gurgle as blood filled his lungs. The first man had more warning. He managed to draw his pistol and fire, but the shot went wide, his horse rearing in panic. Moses grabbed the reins and yanked the animal down, sending the rider tumbling to the ground. Before the man could recover, Moses was on top of him. "Please," the man begged. "Please, I have a family. I have children." Moses looked down at him. This man who hunted human beings for money. This man who tore families apart for profit. This man who probably did not think twice about the families of the people he captured. "Did you think about their families?" Moses asked. "The slaves you caught. The children you sent back to be whipped and sold. Did you think about them?" The man had no answer. Moses killed him quickly. It was more mercy than the man deserved. But Moses was not interested in cruelty. He was interested in results. He stripped the youngest of the 3 men, the one whose body was roughly the same size as his own. He took the man's clothes, his hat, his boots. He took the weapons, 2 pistols, a rifle, ammunition. He took the money the men carried. And then he did something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Using his blade, Moses carefully removed the skin from the dead man's face. It was horrific work. The smell of blood filled his nostrils. His hands shook despite his determination. But he had thought this through carefully. He knew that a mask of cloth or leather would never fool anyone up close. He knew that he needed something more convincing. When he was finished, he had a piece of human skin roughly the size and shape of a face. He treated it with salt from the provisions the men carried, preserving it as best he could. He fashioned straps to hold it in place. Moses put on the dead man's clothes. He pulled the hat low over his forehead. And he placed the skin over his own face, covering the purple birthmark, covering the blind white eye, covering the features that had marked him as a monster for 32 years. He looked at his reflection in the still water of the swamp. A stranger looked back. The mask was not perfect. Up close, in bright light, anyone would notice that something was wrong. But from a distance, in shadow, with the hat pulled low, Moses Walker looked like any other white man traveling the Louisiana roads. The monster had become invisible. Moses spent the next 3 months systematically destroying the Beaumont family. He started with the documents he had stolen. The letters proving Colonel Beaumont's involvement in a conspiracy to assassinate a state legislator were sent anonymously to newspapers in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Natchez. Moses wrote a cover letter explaining the origins of the documents and describing other crimes the colonel had committed. The story exploded across Louisiana. Prominent planter implicated in murder plot. Corruption and conspiracy at Bellefontaine. The newspapers printed every detail. The colonel's business partners were named. His political allies were exposed. Men who had attended his parties and praised his hospitality now rushed to distance themselves from him. Colonel Beaumont tried to deny everything. He claimed the documents were forgeries, fabricated by enemies who wanted to destroy him. But the evidence was too detailed, too specific to be dismissed. Other conspirators, facing their own legal troubles, confirmed the authenticity of the letters to save themselves. In December of 1857, Colonel Philippe Beaumont was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The trial was a sensation. Newspapers from across the country sent reporters to cover it. The colonel hired the best lawyers money could buy, but the evidence was overwhelming. In February of 1858, he was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Madame Beaumont tried to maintain the plantation after her husband's imprisonment. But Moses was not finished with her yet. Using the money he had stolen and the connections he had made through Father Marchand, Moses funded a campaign of sabotage against Bellefontaine. Fires broke out in the sugarcane fields, destroying crops before they could be harvested. Equipment mysteriously broke down at critical moments. Slaves began escaping at an unprecedented rate, guided by contacts on the Underground Railroad who had been given detailed information about the plantation's layout and security. Within 6 months, Bellefontaine was hemorrhaging money. Creditors who had once been patient began demanding immediate payment. Banks that had extended loans called them due. The Beaumont fortune, built over 3 generations, crumbled in less than a year. In August of 1858, Madame Céline Beaumont was forced to sell Bellefontaine to pay her debts. She moved to a small apartment in New Orleans, dependent on the charity of relatives who had once envied her wealth. Moses watched from the shadows as she left the plantation for the last time, riding in a hired carriage instead of her own, wearing last season's fashions because she could no longer afford new clothes. She looked old and broken, a shadow of the woman who had once called him her pet monster. But Moses was not satisfied. The Beaumonts had been punished, but they were still alive. The colonel sat in his prison cell, but he still breathed. The madam lived in reduced circumstances, but she still lived. Moses thought about Delilah waiting for him in the swamp community, carrying his child. He thought about the future he wanted to build, the freedom he wanted to claim. He thought about the promise he had made. He could leave now. The Beaumonts were destroyed. Their wealth was gone. Their reputation was ruined. Their son was dead. Surely that was enough. But it was not enough. Moses had lived 32 years as their property. He had endured 32 years of degradation and torture and humiliation. He had watched Jacques Beaumont fire pistols at his head for sport. He had heard Madame Beaumont call him her monster, her curiosity, her entertainment for guests. They had tried to destroy his humanity. They had almost succeeded. Now he would show them what they had created. The Louisiana State Penitentiary was located in Baton Rouge, a massive brick building that housed the worst criminals in the state. Colonel Beaumont, despite his conviction, had been given preferential treatment due to his former status. He had a private cell, decent food, and limited visiting privileges. Moses spent 2 weeks observing the prison, learning its routines, identifying its weaknesses. He bribed a guard to deliver a message to the colonel, arranging a meeting in the prison chapel, where visitors were sometimes allowed to speak with inmates. When Colonel Beaumont entered the chapel, he expected to see a lawyer or perhaps a former business associate. Instead, he saw a man he did not recognize sitting in the front pew, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. "Who are you?" Beaumont demanded. "What do you want?" The man stood and turned. Then he removed his hat. And his face. Beneath the mask of preserved skin was a visage that Beaumont knew all too well. The purple birthmark. The blind white eye. The features that had disgusted him for 3 decades. "Hello, Colonel," Moses said. Beaumont stumbled backward, his face white with shock. "You? It was you?" "All of it." "All of it," Moses confirmed. "The fire. The documents. The stories in the newspapers. The sabotage. Everything that has happened to you, everything you have lost, it all came from me. I will have you hanged." Beaumont snarled, recovering his composure. "Guards! Guards!" But no guards came. Moses had paid them well to stay away. "I did not come here to be captured," Moses said. "I came here to tell you something. Something I want you to think about for the rest of your miserable life." He stepped closer to Beaumont, close enough that the older man could see every detail of his ruined face. You thought I was nothing. You thought I was less than human. You tried to sell me 3 times, and no one would pay a single dollar for me. I was worthless to you. A burden. A joke. Moses smiled, a terrible expression on his disfigured features. But I destroyed you. I destroyed your plantation, your fortune, your reputation. I killed your son. I put you in this prison. And I did it all alone, with nothing but my mind and my will. He leaned even closer, his breath warm on Beaumont's face. I want you to spend every day of your sentence thinking about that. Thinking about how the worthless monster, the creature that no one wanted, brought down everything you built. I want you to know that you did this to yourself. You created me. You made me what I am. And now you are paying the price. Beaumont was trembling. His face was red with fury and fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but Moses held up a hand. One more thing. Your wife, Madame Celine. She is still alive. She is still free. I could have destroyed her, too. I could have killed her the way I killed Jacques. But I decided to let her live. He paused. For now. Moses put the mask back on his face, transforming himself once again into an anonymous stranger. Every day, for the rest of her life, your wife will wonder when I am coming for her. Every noise in the night, every shadow in the corner, every stranger on the street. She will never know peace. She will never know safety. That is my gift to her. He walked toward the door of the chapel, then stopped and looked back. Goodbye, Colonel. I hope you enjoy prison. I understand the food is terrible and the company is worse. But do not worry. You will have plenty of time to get used to it. Moses Walker walked out of the Louisiana State Penitentiary and disappeared into the Baton Rouge afternoon. No one stopped him. No one recognized him. The slave with the disfigured face had vanished, replaced by an ordinary man in ordinary clothes, invisible in the crowd. He returned to the swamp community where Delilah was waiting. She was heavily pregnant now, only a few weeks from giving birth. When she saw Moses, she burst into tears. I thought you were dead, she sobbed, holding him tightly. I thought they had caught you. They never came close, Moses said, stroking her hair. It is over now. We are leaving. Leaving where? Canada. Father Marchand has arranged everything. There is a ship waiting in New Orleans that will take us to the Gulf, then around Florida and up the Atlantic coast. From there, we travel overland to Ontario. We will be free, Delilah. We will raise our child in freedom. Delilah looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or deception. She found none. What about the Beaumonts? Will they stop hunting us? Moses shook his head. The colonel is in prison. He has no money, no influence, no friends. Madame Beaumont is living on charity. They cannot hunt anyone. They can barely feed themselves. And the others? The bounty hunters? The slave catchers? Moses smiled grimly. A few of them learned not to chase me. The others will give up eventually. $10,000 is not worth dying for. And I have made it very clear that coming after me means dying. They left that night, beginning the long journey north. They traveled by boat, by wagon, by foot, passing through a network of safe houses and friendly contacts that Father Marchand had cultivated over decades. They moved slowly because of Delilah's condition, but they moved steadily, always northward, always toward freedom. In November of 1858, they crossed the border into Canada. Moses Walker stood on Canadian soil and breathed free air for the first time in his life. No more masters. No more chains. No more degradation. He was no longer property. He was a man. 3 weeks later, in a small house in the town of Buxton, Ontario, Delilah gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Hope. She was born free. The years that followed were the happiest of Moses Walker's life. He and Delilah built a home in Buxton, a community of former slaves who had escaped to Canada. Moses found work as a blacksmith, a trade he had learned through observation during his years at Bellefontaine. His hands, which had spent decades cleaning latrines and hauling corpses, now created useful things: tools, horseshoes, hinges, nails. He took pride in his work, pride that had been denied him for so long. Delilah opened a small bakery that became famous throughout the region for its bread and pastries. The skills she had developed in the Beaumont kitchen, skills that had served her oppressors, now served her own family. She taught other women in the community to bake, sharing her knowledge freely, building connections that strengthened the bonds between formerly enslaved people trying to build new lives. Hope grew into a bright, curious child who knew nothing of slavery except the stories her parents told her. She attended school, learned to read and write, played with other children in the fields and forests around Buxton. She never experienced the horrors that had shaped her parents' lives, and Moses was determined to keep it that way. Father Marchand visited once, in the summer of 1860, having finally been forced to leave Louisiana when his abolitionist activities were discovered. He was an old man by then, tired and worn, but his eyes lit up when he saw what Moses and Delilah had built. "I always knew you were special," the priest told Moses. "From the first moment I saw you, I knew there was something extraordinary behind that face. I am glad I lived long enough to see what you became." Moses shook his head. "You made me what I am, Father. You gave me the tools, the reading, the knowledge, the contacts. Without you, I would have died on that plantation." "The tools were nothing without the man who wielded them," Marchand said. "You had the courage to use what I gave you. You had the determination to see it through. That came from inside you, Moses. That was always yours." The priest died the following year, peacefully in his sleep, and was buried in the Buxton Cemetery. Moses visited his grave every Sunday for the rest of his life. The American Civil War began in 1861, and Moses followed the news with intense interest. He watched as the nation that had enslaved him tore itself apart over the very institution that had shaped his existence. He read about the battles, the casualties, the slow, grinding destruction of the Southern way of life. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, Moses wept. For the first time since he had arrived in Canada, he wept, not for himself, for he had already won his freedom, but for the millions still in bondage who now had hope of liberation. And he wept for those who had not survived to see this day. For his mother, who had died bringing him into the world. For all the slaves at Bellefontaine who had suffered and died under the Beaumont regime. For everyone who had been crushed by a system that treated human beings as property. The war ended in 1865. Slavery was abolished. The world that Moses had known, the world of plantations and slave auctions and human beings bought and sold like cattle, ceased to exist. Moses received word that Colonel Beaumont had died in prison in 1864 from an illness that the doctors could not identify. Some said he had simply given up, had lost the will to live after losing everything else. Others said the other prisoners had made his life unbearable, knowing what he had been convicted of. Either way, the man who had called Moses worthless was gone. Madame Celine Beaumont survived until 1871. She died in a charity hospital in New Orleans, alone and forgotten, calling out for servants who no longer existed. Her final years had been marked by paranoia and fear, just as Moses had promised. She saw enemies everywhere. She trusted no one. She jumped at shadows until the day she died. Moses did not celebrate their deaths. He felt no joy, no satisfaction. He felt only a quiet sense of completion, as if a chapter of his life had finally closed. He had kept his promise. He had destroyed them. And then he had built something better from the ashes. Moses Walker died on September 3, 1901, at the age of 76. He passed away in the house he had built with his own hands, surrounded by Delilah, his daughter Hope, and his 7 grandchildren. In the final weeks of his life, he told his story to anyone who would listen. He wanted the truth to be preserved. He wanted people to know what had happened at Bellefontaine, what he had done, and why he had done it. "I am not proud of everything I did," he told his grandson, a young man named Samuel who would later become a lawyer. "I killed men. I took lives." "You did what you had to do," Samuel said. "You did what was necessary to survive." Moses shook his head. "Survival would have been easier. I could have run north from the beginning and never looked back. I could have disappeared into Canada and lived out my days in peace." "Then why did you go back? Why did you risk everything for revenge?" Moses was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Because they needed to know. The Beaumonts and everyone like them. They needed to know that they could not treat people like animals and escape the consequences. They needed to know that the people they oppressed were not less than human. They needed to know that we could think, and plan, and fight back." He looked at his grandson with his one good eye. "I wanted them to fear us. I wanted every slave owner in the South to hear what happened to the Beaumonts and wonder if their own slaves were planning the same thing. I wanted them to look at the people they owned and see not property, but enemies. I wanted them to know that their system was built on sand, that it could not last, that one day it would all come crashing down." "And it did," Samuel said. "Yes," Moses agreed. "It did." He died the next morning, peacefully holding Delilah's hand. His last words were to her. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing me when no one else could." Moses Walker was buried in the Buxton Cemetery beside Father Marchand and dozens of other former slaves who had made the journey to freedom. His tombstone was simple, bearing only his name and dates and a single line that he had requested. * Moses Walker *. 1825–1901 *. I was not a monster. I was a man. *. The story of Moses Walker was never told in the official history books. It was too dangerous, too unsettling for a nation trying to heal from the wounds of slavery. The fires at Bellefontaine were recorded as accidents. The death of Jacques Beaumont was attributed to alcohol. The downfall of Colonel Beaumont was blamed on his own criminal behavior, with no mention of the slave who had orchestrated it all. But the truth survived in other ways. In the stories passed down through generations of black families. In the whispered legend of the Louisiana Bayou. In the knowledge that one man, a man that everyone dismissed as worthless, had brought down an empire. Moses Walker proved something important. He proved that the system of slavery, for all its power and brutality, was fundamentally fragile. It depended on the belief that enslaved people were less than human, that they could not think or plan or resist in meaningful ways. Moses shattered that belief. He showed that a man with a disfigured face and no apparent value could be the most dangerous enemy imaginable. He showed that intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle, including the entire apparatus of human bondage. He showed that the people at the bottom of society, the people that everyone ignored and dismissed, had the power to change everything. The slave too ugly to sell became the most wanted man in Louisiana. The monster that no one wanted became the architect of his oppressor's destruction. The man who was told he was worthless proved himself more capable than all the wealthy, educated, powerful people who had tormented him. That is the legacy of Moses Walker. Not the violence he committed or the revenge he exacted, but the truth he revealed. The truth that every human being, no matter how they look, no matter what circumstances they were born into, has inherent worth and dignity. The truth that no system of oppression, no matter how powerful it seems, can survive forever when the people it oppresses decide to fight back. Moses Walker was not a monster. He was a man. And he proved it in ways that the Beaumont family, and everyone like them, never forgot. This was his story. A story that haunts the bayous of Louisiana to this day. A story that deserves to be remembered. Because when we forget stories like this, we forget what human beings are capable of, both the cruelty that creates men like Moses Walker, and the courage that allows them to rise above it. He was considered too ugly to sell. He was treated worse than an animal for 32 years. He was told he was worthless, a burden, a joke. And he burned them all. Not with fire alone, but with the unstoppable force of a human mind that refused to be broken. A mind that watched, and learned, and planned, and waited. A mind that turned weakness into strength, invisibility into power, suffering into fuel for transformation. Moses Walker won. Against all odds. Against the entire system of American slavery. Against everything that tried to destroy him. He won.